Jon Snow stood on the ramparts of Winterfell, his breath frosting the air as a gray morning light spread across the castle grounds. The night had been mercilessly cold, colder than even the harshest memory of the North's endless winters. Yet here he was, alive and breathing. The corpses of the fallen had long been burned, and the great courtyard below remained scarred by blackened patches of earth. Though the living had emerged victorious in the last great battle against the dead, Westeros now lay in ruin. Crops were frozen in the fields, entire villages decimated, their survivors nowhere to be found. Jon often wondered if the price of victory had not been too steep. But there was no turning back now, for once blood is spilled, it does not flow in reverse. He shifted his gaze north, beyond the castle walls. The gate stood open, allowing in a furious wind that battered the timber and the heavy iron-banded doors. He would have it closed soon, but for the moment he waited for news. Men had ventured out scouting the terrain between Winterfell and the remnants of the army of the dead. The threat was not entirely gone, for pockets of White Walkers were rumored to lurk in the frozen wasteland. Gripping the hilt of Long Claw, Jon recalled the countless times he had crossed swords with them, had felt the unearthly cold emanating from their blades. Each memory sent a subtle shiver along his spine. He closed his eyes. The face of Daenerys Targaryen came unbidden, luminous and determined. He remembered her tears the night they lost Rhaegal, the second of her dragons, felled by the sorcery and spears of their enemies. He remembered the hush of her voice when she commanded Drogon to unleash fire upon the horde of whites pressing at Winterfell's gates. She was gone now, taking her armies south in search of opportunity, alliances, a new future that might salvage the realm. They had parted not in anger but with a sharp rift forming between them. The question of titles, leadership, and rightful claim had hung suspended in the air. He still felt a pang of longing at the thought of her. The sound of approaching footsteps made him open his eyes. Ser Davos Seaworth, face drawn and hair whipped by the relentless wind, ascended the rampart steps. His hood was dusted with snow, beads of frost clinging to the gray in his beard. "There's word from the scouts, Your Grace," Davos said, addressing Jon by a title Jon detested. He had never desired to be king in the north, but those who followed him saw no other man to lead them. Jon turned fully to face him, his dark cloak swirling about his legs. "What news?" "They found something, or rather someone." Davos paused, mouth parted as though he needed a moment to gather the proper words. "A white, alone, but not attacking. A messenger, it seems. It allowed itself to be taken captive, if that's the right phrase. No resistance. They brought it into the courtyard, guarded by at least 8 men. It was carrying a banner. The banner is black with jagged blue lines running through it. Looks like ice shards. We've never seen anything like it." A heavy silence followed. Jon's heart hammered against his chest as he thought of the countless times the whites had attacked them mindlessly, following the Night King's will. Never once had any of them come in peace. The notion of a white carrying a banner was an unthinkable concept. "Take me to it," Jon said finally, a sense of dread and curiosity warring within him. Davos nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his features, as though he were glad to share responsibility for this bizarre turn of events. Together, they descended the steps. The courtyard was wide, and it resonated with a hush that reminded Jon painfully of the morning after the long night's battle. The men who stood guard around the white clearly wrestled with their nerves. Their eyes shimmered with an unease that threatened to break into panic at any moment. In their midst stood the white, hunched, its flesh gray and half-frozen. Patches of scalp showed through ragged bits of hair. It wore tattered furs that might once have been part of a night's watch cloak, but were now stiff and blackened by ice. Yet in one bony hand, it clutched a banner of black cloth, indeed embroidered with an angular pattern in shimmering ice-blue thread. Its eyes burned that familiar eerie pale blue, empty yet somehow filled with an otherworldly intelligence. Jon approached, each step measured, his hand on the pommel of Long Claw. He glanced at the watchers, silently instructing them to hold steady. Then he addressed the white, his voice low but firm. "What are you?" The white did not speak. Instead, it raised its free hand, an unsettling gesture that made more than one guard flinch. Slowly, it reached behind its back and retrieved a small roll of hide, sealed by an odd crystalline token. Carefully, it extended the hide toward Jon. The entire courtyard tensed, anticipating an attack, but none came. Jon Snow took the hide, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He glanced at Davos, whose uneasy nod urged him to continue. Breaking the crystalline seal, Jon unrolled the hide. The script scratched across it was written in a dark blue substance, possibly a dye gleaned from some unknown source. The letters resembled the common tongue, though more angular, as if shaped by an unnatural hand. He read it once, then twice, to ensure his eyes did not deceive him. I, the Night King, request a parley with the king in the north. The living and the dead stand at a threshold. War will bring only endless ruin. I propose a meeting on the fields of ice, halfway between Winterfell and the new dominion of the others. Come with no more than 10 men, unarmed. We will speak of a future that may grant an end to bloodshed. Should you refuse, we march. Let us shape a different fate. Jon's hands trembled, clutching the message. In all his nightmares, in the swirl of prophecies and horrors he had endured, not once had he imagined such a request. The Night King communicating through words, seeking a parley, defied all reason. The others had always seemed mindless in their pursuit of snuffing out life. Now, a new dimension had opened before Jon's eyes, a glimmer of possibility wrapped in more fear than he had known in many a battle. Maester Wolkan must see this, said Davos, his voice hushed. Jon nodded. Yes. But first, have the men place the white under secure guard. Make sure it cannot break free, but do not harm it unless it attacks. He glanced at the terrifying figure. The white's face remained as impassive as a corpse's face could be, but there was no hostility in its stance, only a grim patience. As the men cautiously moved forward to bind the white, Jon felt a swirl of questions assault his mind. Was this a trick? If so, what cunning end did it serve? Or was the Night King truly capable of reason, of negotiation? The implications of such a possibility staggered him. He looked again at the message, reading the carefully constructed lines. If the Night King wanted a parley, it meant the great war that had ravaged Westeros might not be as final as they had believed. Perhaps the threat had only changed shape. Turning to Davos, Jon said, send a raven to Daenerys in the south. She needs to know what's happening here. He paused, clenching his jaw. And to Sansa as well, in the Vale. The old knight nodded, his expression somber. Aye, it will be done. But you realize if you accept this invitation, we sail into dark waters. Jon exhaled heavily. Dark waters are all we have ever known, Davos. If there's a chance for peace, we should take it. If it's an ambush, I'd rather find out sooner than later. Either way, we have to act. He tore his gaze away from the white as it was led to the dungeons, a slow parade of men wrapping thick chains around it. The white did not resist. Jon watched until the last of the guards led it through the northern archway, then he turned and strode toward the great hall, Davos by his side. The skies overhead loomed dark, the wind biting. In the distance, the ancient weirwood stood silent, branches laden with fresh snow. It felt as if even the old gods were holding their breath. That night, Jon struggled to sleep. His dreams spun with images of a figure crowned with ice, standing under the swirling lights of the aurora. The figure extended a hand and fire bloomed at its fingertips. The dream made no sense, yet it left Jon with an uneasy feeling of inevitability. When he woke at dawn, he rose from the furs of his bed, dressed quickly in layers, and ventured outside. The wind had died, leaving the air chill but still. Ravens swirled overhead, their caws echoing in the silent courtyard. He knew a decision had to be made swiftly before fear turned men's hearts to reckless violence. He found Davos already in the hall with Maester Wolkan, reading over the message by torchlight. When Jon approached, Wolkan cleared his throat. The writing is in a form of the common tongue, but clearly shaped by an unfamiliar hand. The words, however, are quite clear. Jon nodded. I've decided to accept the Night King's proposal for parley. Gather a party of 10. Men I trust. Men who faced the dead before and lived to tell it. Davos rubbed his temples. I doubt you'll find a man who's not terrified at the thought. But yes, we can muster a small group. I assume you want me there as well. Of course, Jon said with a slight smirk, though the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. Your counsel is too valuable. They spent the next hours making preparations. The watchers on the walls reported no movement, no sign of an advancing horde. Instead, the horizon remained eerily calm. That calm, they all knew, could be shattered at any moment. By midday, their small party stood at the gates. Jon wore thick layers of black and gray, the stark sigil on his breast, long claw at his hip, but he would carry no other weapon openly. for the Night King's request stated clearly that they come unarmed. Davos, Tormund Giantsbane, Brienne of Tarth, and 6 others assembled in somber readiness. Despite the mild protests that they were ignoring the parley's demands, they concealed a few weapons in the pack horses. Only a fool would place complete trust in an enemy that had once sought to destroy all life. Jon gave final instructions to those remaining behind. If they did not return within 3 days, Sansa was to summon every ally they had. The gates of Winterfell would close, and the North would brace for war once more. Hearts were heavy as the small company departed Winterfell, the wind whispering across the snowdrifts like a warning. The journey north felt strangely familiar. The desolation brought back memories of the war they had so recently fought. They passed a ruined village where only skeletal frames of houses stood, ice-laced beams pointing skyward like accusing fingers. No living soul greeted them. The silence forced introspection, and Jon found himself wondering if the realm had reached the brink of collapse. Could it be that the Night King, too, had felt the realm was on a path to mutual annihilation? They traveled a full day before reaching the so-called Fields of Ice. The land was flat, covered in a thick blanket of crystalline snow that glittered beneath the pale sun. Sparse, wind-torn trees marked the horizon. Jon signaled for his party to halt at a cluster of frost-rimmed rocks, well within sight of the open terrain. Here they would wait for the Night King to appear, if he intended to appear at all. As the light began to fade, they saw movement to the north. At first it was just a dark blur on the horizon, but slowly it resolved into a procession. Not an army, but a small group like theirs. Jon counted 5 figures in front, each draped in what looked like white furs. Behind them came a tall figure astride some unknown beast of burden, flanked by others that moved in perfect unison. Jon's heart clenched as he recognized the unnatural grace. White Walkers. The party from the dead approached until they were about 100 paces away. In the center, riding a pale horse with hooves that left no mark in the snow, was the Night King. He wore an ornate crown of ice that shimmered in the last rays of daylight. His skin was a translucent bluish-white, his features chiseled and severe. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly luminescence that made it impossible to read his expression as human. Yet there was a strange solemnity about him, a majesty that Jon had never noticed before in the chaos of battle. Jon walked forward alone, each crunch of snow beneath his boots sounding thunderous in the hush. The Night King dismounted, fluid as a serpent of ice. Around him, White Walkers remained still, their weapons made of ice, yet they made no move to threaten. Their leaders gazed locked onto Jon, and for a heartbeat that felt like a lifetime, the living man and the King of the Dead stared at each other across a breath of frozen air. Jon swallowed, summoning every ounce of courage. "You asked for a parley." The Night King nodded slowly, and as he opened his mouth, an unsettling voice emerged. It was both whisper and roar, a voice that rasped like wind across a frozen lake, but with a timbre that suggested vast and ancient knowledge. "Yes." Jon felt the hair on his arms stand on end. The dead spoke in the tongue of the living. Perhaps the greatest surprise was that he sounded neither monstrous nor savage. Carefully, Jon extended an open hand, a gesture of respect without aggression. "We've come as agreed. 10 men unarmed." He paused, glancing at the armed White Walkers. "Are you truly offering peace?" The Night King stood motionless, crystalline crown catching the dying light. "Long have we walked, though the living forget. Winter falls, summer returns, an endless cycle. We are created by the weavers of old, shaped to be the guardians of the far north. The wars of men drove us to ascend south, to claim the dominion that was prophesied. But the world is changed. The realm stands on the brink of oblivion. We too would suffer if the land is scorched and laid to waste. There is no place to rule if there is nothing left." Jon's mind spun. He tried to steady his breathing. "You marched an army of the dead upon Winterfell, slaughtered thousands. Why parley now?" The cold eyes flickered. "You fought with dragons of fire and men of steel. You forced us back. The living proved more resilient than my ancestors foretold. Now we come to offer a choice. We can continue this war until no living thing remains in the north, or we can forge a pact. You and I, the living and the dead, share the realm." A hush fell. The group of men behind Jon shifted uneasily, but none spoke. Jon's mind raced with images of the countless dead, the heartbreak, the devastation, but also the possibility that further war would extinguish any hope for recovery. "How would we share?" The Night King raised one gloved hand. At the motion, the other White Walkers stepped forward, drawing a rough map on the snow with their ice-wrought spears. The landmass of Westeros took shape. Then, with a single finger, the Night King traced a line across the north, a meandering demarcation that cut above Winterfell, dipping south near the neck and sweeping westward. The lands of ice remain under our domain, free from the living. To the south, men may rebuild under their rule of fire. Jon's heart pounded. Splitting Westeros was unthinkable. The north was already battered, and ceding a vast portion to the dead would be akin to a living tomb. But if the alternative was endless war, was this truly a lesser evil? Tormund stepped up beside Jon, his breath fogging the air. How can we trust them? They kill everything they touch. The Night King's gaze shifted. The dead obey. With this pact, our hunger abates, our hold over them is commanded to remain north of the line. The living shall not cross, nor the dead. If they do, the penalty is war once more. Jon closed his eyes, remembering the old stories of the Long Night, the forging of the wall, the precarious peace. Now, the wall had fallen, the realm was changed. Could a new line in the snow truly replace the ancient barrier? What of those who already live in the far north? Clans, free folk. You must gather them to the south of the line, the Night King intoned. Spare them or they become ours. A chill deeper than the northern wind spread through Jon. This was a lesser form of conquest, yet conquest all the same. But was there another path? Even with Daenerys's dragons and the armies of men, they had barely survived the last assault. Another wave might finish what the first began. You want a formal treaty? The Night King nodded once. Pledge your word as the king in the north. We will pledge ours. The realm of the living to remain south, the realm of ice to remain north. Where ice meets fire, let there be caution, not conflict. Jon glanced at Davos, who watched with a pained expression. The Onion Knight gave no sign of immediate protest, though his eyes told Jon to tread carefully. This was beyond any normal negotiation. The magnitude of the consequences was staggering. Jon turned back to the Night King. I cannot decide this alone. I must speak with the other rulers, with the Queen of the South. The Night King's lips parted in something that might have been a smirk or simply a deathly grin. The Mother of Dragons. Her flames scalded my ranks. He paused. Send word. We will wait. But not long. Jon squared his shoulders. How long do we have? Until the next moon is full. The Night King's voice took on a sharper edge. Then we march again. Silence gripped the field. Slowly, the undead king mounted his pale horse. We will await your answer. Jon wanted to ask more. His mind teemed with questions about the origin of the others, the nature of their magic, whether they truly had any sense of mercy. But the Night King offered no further words. He turned his mount and, with the White Walkers at his side, began to ride north, drifting across the snow like phantoms. Within moments, they vanished into the icy haze, leaving Jon and his companions alone with the cold wind rustling across the plain. Tormund cursed under his breath. Parley with the dead. Never thought I'd see the day. Davos ran a hand through his beard. Seems we're living in strange times. Or dying in them, as the case may be. Jon gazed at the line the White Walkers had traced in the snow, already fading beneath drifting flakes. He could almost feel the presence of that boundary. We need to get back to Winterfell, he said at last. And then someone must ride south to speak with Daenerys. She'll want to see that message. Brienne's solemn voice broke the quiet. This dividing line, do you really think it can hold? Jon closed his eyes for a moment. I don't know, but we must consider the offer. Another war could end us all. He sighed heavily. Let's go. As they made their return journey, thoughts swirled endlessly in Jon's mind. A truce with the Night King was both madness and hope. Could Westeros survive such a division? Could the North truly come under the constant shadow of the dead and still be a place for the living? Or was this a trap, a means for the others to bide their time until they struck again? Upon returning to Winterfell, Jon called a council in the Great Hall. The lords and knights who had survived the Great War were fewer now, their ranks thinned by death. Sansa Stark was notably absent, still overseeing the Vale with the support of Lady Royce. But he had Gendry, now a lord in the Riverlands, and Lady Brienne represented the interests of the Tarth name. Davos and Torm. UND, of course, were there. The hall was dimly lit, the shadows dancing in corners as if echoing the tension in every mind. Jon stood at the head of the table, the Night King's message in hand, and he spoke plainly of what had transpired on the fields of ice. There were gasps, curses, and confused murmurs when he described the Night King's words, the notion that the dead sought a negotiated boundary. Some cried it was impossible, that the dead were demons to be vanquished. Others argued that the realm could not endure another assault. The debate raged for hours until the fires burned low and voices grew hoarse. In the end, Jon declared that he would send ravens to Daenerys at Dragonstone or wherever her southern campaign had taken her, and to every ally they had. A great gathering of leaders would be called at Winterfell before the next full moon so that all might weigh the choice between an unthinkable alliance and a war that could bring utter annihilation. Word went out carried by swift riders and ravens across the snows. The response was swift and anxious. Daenerys Targaryen replied that she was sailing for White Harbor at once, bringing the forces she could muster. Lord Tyrion, her hand, wrote in careful lines that they must proceed with caution and cunning. Sansa declared she would come north with as many men of the Vale as would heed her call. Others promised to attend, though none came without fear or suspicion. The days passed in a blur of preparations and anxious waiting. The captured White remained chained in the dungeons, quiet and motionless except for a soft rattling breath. It made no attempt to escape, no sign of the usual ravenous impulses. Perhaps the Night King had left it as a living or unliving token of his sincerity. Finally, a chill morning found the courtyard of Winterfell filled once again with the sounds of marching men and stamping horses. Daenerys arrived in a procession of unsullied and northern bannermen who had fought alongside her. Drogon soared overhead, the last living dragon of the Targaryen line. The beast circled once, a dark shape against the pale sky, before settling near the outer ramparts. His roar rattled the very stones of Winterfell as if reminding all that, though diminished, fire yet lived. Jon stood at the gates to greet her. The moment he saw Daenerys, his heart twisted. She wore a heavy fur-lined cloak, her silver-gold hair braided and pinned beneath a hood of white. In her eyes, he glimpsed sorrow and determination both. He bowed his head. "Your Grace." She studied him, searching his face. Jon, the single syllable carried warmth and distance all at once. They had once been lovers, partners in the Great War. Now time and losses stood between them. But a flicker of old feeling still glimmered, tempered by the burdens of their stations. He led her inside, where the lords of the North, the Vale, and other regions had gathered. Tyrion Lannister offered Jon a curt nod. Varys stood with arms folded, face inscrutable. Grey Worm stood stoic as ever, guarding his queen. One by one, the others arrived, Sansa Stark, regal in her bearing, with Brienne at her side. Arya had not returned, off on some errand of her own. Gendry clasped forearms with Jon briefly, then took a seat, a reminder of the forging of new ties. Lyanna Mormont, the fiery lady of Bear Island, had fallen in battle, and her absence left an echo in the Great Hall. The specter of so many lost hung like a shroud over them all. They convened at the great wooden table, warmed by the crackling hearth. Jon recounted his meeting with the Night King once more for those who had not heard. The hush in the room grew thick as he described the monstrous offer to divide Westeros between the living and the dead. When he finished, Daenerys stood and let her gaze sweep across the gathered faces. "Westeros has bled enough," she said, her voice carrying a regal resonance. "We lost a dragon to the Night King. We lost thousands of good men. But dividing the land with those who slaughtered our people, it goes against every instinct. The Targaryen blood in me demands justice. Yet I also know the price of continuing this war may be the total destruction of our realm." Sansa exhaled, her eyes flicking to Jon, then to Daenerys. "If we give them the north above the neck, we condemn the free folk, the mountain clans, perhaps even the people of Deepwood Motte. Is there truly enough room for all of us south of this line?" She trembled slightly, though her composure remained. "And how can we trust that the dead won't march again the moment it suits them?" Tyrion, ever the voice of strategy, cleared his throat. "A treaty is only as strong as the mutual fear and respect holding it. Right now, the Night King fears the dragons, or at least what remains of their power. He also respects that the living cannot be easily overrun. We fear his inexhaustible ability to raise the dead, to spread ice and darkness over the land. Common interest in avoiding mutual devastation is often the basis for alliances, even among enemies." Gendry's voice cut in, raw with emotion. "But they killed my friends. They nearly killed me. We all saw how they tried to destroy everything. Now they want a piece of Westeros to freeze over. How can we allow that?" Silence followed until Davos interjected quietly. "I understand how you feel, lad. I lost my king, my friends. Hell, we all lost people. But we must think not only of the past, but the future." Daenerys nodded slowly, scanning the hall. "The question is, can a shared peace last? Or will it only postpone another war?" Jon lifted his gaze. "The Night King gave us until the next full moon to decide. I say we at least meet with him again, try to negotiate terms. Perhaps we can insist on a smaller territory for the dead. Or at least secure better guarantees. Let them remain beyond the old wall if that's possible. Rebuild the wall, maybe? We have to explore every option." Discussion flared anew. Most in the hall were torn between fury at the notion of giving anything to the Night King and dread of facing his armies again. In the end, it was decided that Daenerys and Jon would lead a formal delegation to parley with the Night King. They would demand concessions, including the re-establishment of a barrier or some magical oath that would prevent the dead from trespassing south. The rest of their allies would remain close, ready to fight if negotiations failed. Preparations began at once. Ravens were sent out to gather any remaining sorcerers or mages rumored to dwell in distant corners. The archmasters in Old Town were also petitioned for knowledge about wards or old spells that might bind the others to their promise. Teams were dispatched to salvage anything from the remnants of the wall that might be of use. Meanwhile, Daenerys had her blacksmiths forging new dragon glass weapons, not to break the parley's terms but to be ready if the worst came. As the day of the meeting approached, dread settled over Winterfell. The northern skies loomed perpetually gray as though the sun itself hesitated to shine upon an uncertain future. In the courtyard, Jon watched Daenerys pat the scaled flank of Drogon, who snorted plumes of hot breath into the air. Tyrion stood beside her, going over final details in a hushed tone. Jon stepped forward, feeling the weight of memory. He recalled the awe he felt the first time he saw Drogon. Now, that awe was tinted by sadness, remembering Rhaegal and Viserion, the dragons that had perished in this war of ice and fire. Daenerys noticed him and offered a faint smile. "We're as ready as we'll ever be." Jon nodded, his voice quiet. "This is uncharted territory, but we'll face it together." She looked away for a moment, her expression conflicted. "Together," she repeated, though the ghost of their past still lingered between them. They had parted once, uncertain of love or loyalty, but fate had thrown them back into each other's path in the form of this unimaginable threat. At dawn the following day, the expedition set forth. Jon and Daenerys rode at the head, flanked by Davos, Tyrion, Brienne, Grey Worm, and a select group. Drogon flew overhead, a vigilant shadow that soared and circled. They traveled north, passing the same desolate landscapes that Jon had crossed before. The wind seemed colder than ever, the hush of the snow-laden fields reminiscent of a white graveyard. Even the ravens were silent, as though no living thing dared disturb the hush. It took them a day and a half to reach the appointed place. It was not the exact spot of the initial meeting, but farther north, close to the ruin of the shattered wall. When they arrived, they saw a sight that made even Daenerys gasp. The Night King stood upon a rise of ice, a pale fortress of frost behind him. White walkers lined the ridges like silent sentinels, their eyes glowing. Yet none moved to attack. It was as if they had choreographed a tableau of glacial supremacy, waiting for the living to approach. Drogon landed with a thud, sending up a plume of snow. Daenerys dismounted, every inch a queen, her face set in a regal mask. Jon joined her, his cloak snapping in the cutting wind. The delegation advanced slowly, heartbeats thudding in their chests. The dead parted to allow them passage. The dread in the air was nearly overwhelming, but no violence came. The Night King descended from his frosty dais. He wore a new mantle of white, embroidered with threads of black. His icy crown glimmered. In the hush, his eyes met Daenerys's. She stared at him defiantly, remembering how his hand had slain her dragon Viserion and twisted him into an undead monstrosity. The tension crackled like lightning in a storm. Finally, she spoke. "You request a treaty that spares your realm and ours. We will hear your conditions, but we have demands of our own." The Night King's voice rose, resonant as a glacier calving. "The living are bold to make demands, but speak." Daenerys lifted her chin. "We want no dead south of the border. We will rebuild the wall or establish wards to keep you and your whites from passing. In return, you will have no interference from us, so long as you do not cross that border with hostile intent." Jon took a step forward, adding, "And we ask you to let the free folk remain in the far north if they choose. They are of a hardy stock. If they wish to brave the cold, let them do so unmolested." A flicker of something like amusement passed across the Night King's alabaster features. "The free folk have bled the land for generations. But they are your people, king in the north, not ours. If they remain, they must swear not to raise arms against us." Tormund, who had insisted on coming despite the danger, gritted his teeth at that. "My people bend no knee to the dead." The Night King regarded him with a gaze of frosted calm. "Then they will freeze." Jon placed a hand on Tormund's arm, urging restraint. "Those who wish to leave shall be granted safe passage south. For the ones who stay, can we at least agree to a truce so long as they do not harm you?" The Night King paused as if weighing the matter. His voice rumbled, "They may remain. But if one so much as draws a blade against our kind, the punishment will be absolute. This is our land now." Davos cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We have also looked into certain wards or spells that might be placed along the border. These wards would keep the dead from crossing uninvited and vice versa." He glanced around nervously, uncertain how the Night King would react. The icy monarch inclined his head in elegant acknowledgement. Such wards can be placed if they do not harm what is ours. We will not allow your spells to destroy us. But if they only stand as barriers, so be it. Tyrion, standing beside Daenerys, spoke softly. And how do we enforce the rest of the terms? If either side breaks the treaty, how do we hold them accountable? The Night King turned his glacial gaze upon the imp that is the risk of all agreements between enemies. But fear is a powerful enforcer. If your dragons burn our dead, we will respond with a new onslaught. If our dead rise in your lands, you will respond with dragon fire. Mutual annihilation if either side betrays the pact. Is that not deterrent enough? A hush settled. Tyrion nodded slowly, lips pressed tight. So be it. Then Daenerys took a breath, stepping closer. You took my dragon, Viserion. Will you return what is left of him to us for a proper burning? Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her grief. Let us cleanse him from this undeath. For the first time, the Night King's alien features betrayed a flicker of something akin to regret or reflection. He served me, but he is gone now. When your other dragon's fire struck him, the magic that bound his body disintegrated. There is nothing left of him but fragments of bone and ice. If you wish them, seek them at the far edge of the Frostfangs. Daenerys swallowed, nodding stiffly. She had suspected that was the case, yet hearing it from the Night King's own lips stirred her anguish anew. With the major points outlined, the two sides spent hours forging the details. They spoke of boundaries, lines across the map, how far the land of ice would extend, how much territory men could keep. The White Walkers demanded free roam of the Shivering Sea along the northern coast. The living demanded free passage for merchant ships in the warmer southern waters. On and on the negotiations went, tense and surreal, as men and monsters argued over the fate of an entire continent. Finally, the sky dimmed to twilight. As a bitter wind swept across the impromptu gathering, the treaty was nearly complete. The living would rebuild or conjure wards along a new boundary that approximated the ancient location of the wall. The Night King and his White Walkers would remain to the north, claimed as their realm, with no incursion south unless invited. The living agreed to cede that land under the penalty of total war if they ever attempted to reclaim it. Prisoners of war or captured whites from the previous battles would be exchanged or destroyed depending on each side's preference. An uneasy hush followed as the details were finalized. Daenerys turned to Jon, voice soft. Have we just given away the north? All that the Starks and Targaryens have fought to protect? Jon stared out at the endless expanse of white. We've given them the far north. We keep Winterfell, the neck, everything south of that. If we can find a way to push the boundary even farther north, we will in time. But for now, let's survive. The moment of signing arrived. The Night King lifted a spear of ice and cut his palm, letting a drop of shimmering blue fluid fall upon a scrap of hide. Daenerys hesitated, then sliced her finger with a small blade, letting a drop of red blood fall beside the blue. The two drops merged, forming a swirl of purple and black. A hush settled that felt like the final hush before dawn. Two worlds had collided, forging an uneasy peace. Jon's stomach churned as he watched. He glanced around at the assembled White Walkers and Whites. They stood motionless, but the sense of their supernatural presence pressed upon him. Could such a fragile arrangement truly stand? Or had they merely bought a brief respite from the apocalypse? The Night King raised his hand and a hollow horn sounded from the fortress of ice. His host began to turn, disappearing into the swirling snow. Then he, too, turned his gaze to Jon, a final, lingering look. A silent warning, or perhaps an acknowledgement. Then the icy monarch was gone, vanishing into the deepening twilight. Daenerys let out a breath, her shoulders sagging. Tyrion rubbed his eyes, tension draining from him. Davos shook his head in disbelief. Tormund spat into the snow, a mixture of scorn and relief. Slowly, the living made their way back to their mounts and to Drogon. They had accomplished something that defied all logic, brokered a ceasefire with the dead. On the journey back to Winterfell, the tension did not dissipate. Instead, it transformed. They had avoided another war for now, but the cost was high. How would the people of the North react to losing so much land? How would the free folk take to living under a constant threat or to migrating south in massive numbers? And how would the rest of Westeros respond when they learned that the living had, in effect, handed a portion of the continent to a fearsome undead king? Jon stared at the horizon where a faint glow marked the sun's descent. He thought of Sansa, who would likely see this as a betrayal of the memory of their father. He thought of Daenerys, who had just made the hardest decision of her life in pursuit of peace. He thought of the thousands who would be uprooted, forced to abandon ancestral lands that had stood for generations. And yet, in his heart, he believed this was the only way to prevent an utter cataclysm. When they finally reached Winterfell, it was near midnight. The torches along the ramparts illuminated the weary procession. Guards opened the gates, and the travelers entered with hearts as heavy as their limbs. Messengers were dispatched to summon the gathered lords to the great hall for an urgent meeting even at this late hour. They needed to hear what had transpired, to learn that a treaty, unthinkable as it was, had been signed. It took time, but eventually a crowd formed. The hall was full of anxious whispers. Sansa stood by the head of the table, her face pale but resolute. Brienne was at her side, hand on the pommel of her sword. Gendry, Tormund, the lords of the Vale, the Riverlands, the few from the Reach who had ventured north to see this through, they all waited, hearts pounding. Jon and Daenerys moved to the front. Tyrion, Davos, and Grey Worm flanked them. The hush that settled was absolute. Jon cleared his throat, eyes flicking from face to face. "We have made peace with the dead," he said. The words seemed to echo in the ancient hall, followed by a collective intake of breath. He explained the agreement, how the Night King would remain north of a newly established border, how the living would hold the south. As he spoke, he watched the faces of those gathered. Some paled, others reddened with outrage. A few appeared thoughtful, recognizing the logic of preserving life at all costs. When he finished, the silence was broken by shouts and curses. Lyanna Mormont was gone, but her spirit seemed echoed in the fury of the Mormont clansmen who remained, outraged at ceding Bear Island. Others from smaller northern houses demanded vengeance for all they had lost. But some, especially those who had seen the army of the dead firsthand, nodded in grim acceptance, relieved at any path that might spare them from more carnage. Sansa raised a hand for quiet. She turned to Jon, her voice trembling slightly. "We have always said the North remembers. It remembers the cost of the long night, the betrayal, the horrors visited upon us. Now we are expected to trust these creatures? Or at least trust they won't violate this border once they rebuild their forces?" Jon looked at his sister, his eyes anguished. "Trust is not part of this. Caution is. This treaty doesn't rely on trust, it relies on fear of mutual destruction. We keep dragonglass and a dragon to defend ourselves if they cross. They keep their whites and monstrous magic to threaten us if we invade. We've entered a cold war, Sansa, not a warm peace. But it might be the only way to save the realm." Her gaze softened, though sorrow lingered in her eyes. "Then we must manage the resettlement," she said. "We must gather all who dwell in the far north and bring them south before the new border is sealed. We cannot leave them to the mercy of the White Walkers." Daenerys nodded, turning to the assembled lords. "I will provide ships and resources as needed. We can ferry people from the northernmost coasts. The Unsullied will help maintain order with respect for local customs while this great migration occurs." Tyrion stepped forward. "It will be the greatest logistical challenge Westeros has ever seen. We must set up camps, ensure food supply, prevent disease and chaos. But if we do it carefully, it can be done." One of the lords of the Vale blustered, "And who pays for all this? The crown is nearly bankrupt, ravaged by wars. The lands are scorched." Davos replied, "We'll do what we must. The alternative is more war. We cannot afford that in coin or blood." Gradually, the outcries lessened. The plan began to take shape, to prepare a massive resettlement, to fortify a new barrier, to gather every last shard of knowledge that might reinforce magical wards, and to remain vigilant for any sign of betrayal from the Night King. Long into the night they debated, planned, and argued. Tormund eventually rose and declared that he would travel north to speak with the Free Folk, to urge them south or broker a non-aggression pact for those stubborn enough to remain. Others pledged to help in various ways. The mood in the hall was tense but resolute. They had started down a road none could have foreseen. Finally, as dawn's first light grayed the sky, the meeting adjourned. Daenerys lingered beside Jon in the now empty hall. He stood near the hearth, staring into the dying embers. She approached quietly, her footsteps echoing. He turned, catching the weariness in her face. The fur-lined cloak made her look every inch a northern queen, though the blood of the dragon flowed in her veins. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. She allowed a mirthless chuckle. "I have just agreed to share a continent with the very being who tried to destroy us all. I'm cold and exhausted, but I'm alive." Jon nodded, glancing at the fading fire. "I keep wondering if we've damned ourselves, or if we've saved everyone. Sometimes the line between the two is so thin I can't see it." She reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "We made the best choice we could, given the circumstances. The price of war was too great." He shifted closer, the warmth of her hand a brief solace against the chill. "I know," he whispered, "but it still weighs on me." For a moment they stood there, quiet in each other's company. The ghosts of their past lingered, the uncertainty of their future pressed in. Jon thought of the thousands of families who would be uprooted, the ancient strongholds that would be abandoned. He also thought of the new beginnings that might sprout in safer lands, the children who might grow up not knowing the terror of the dead. At length, Daenerys withdrew her hand. "We'll move forward," she said, almost as if convincing herself. "And we'll do whatever is necessary to protect our people, whether from the dead or from each other." Jon gently took her hand before it fell away. "Together," he murmured. She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes flickering with old feelings that had never fully died. "Yes," she said quietly. They parted ways in the hall, each going to tend to their duties. Outside, the sky grew brighter, revealing a battered land on the cusp of an unimaginable transformation. The ravens took flight, carrying the news of the truce to every corner of Westeros, to Essos, even beyond, sparking awe and disbelief wherever it was heard. The north, seat of the ancient Stark dynasty, would be forever changed. Days turned into weeks. An exodus began as free folk, northern clans, and small folk from the scattered villages gathered, forming caravans heading south. Ships arrived at White Harbor to ferry refugees down the coast. The roads clogged with wagons. Children cried, mothers worried. Men scouted for bandits or hidden pockets of undead. But for the most part, the White Walkers kept to their new domain, a silent, watchful presence that made the hair stand on the back of any traveler's neck if they strayed too far north. At Winterfell, Daenerys and Jon oversaw the efforts. Sansa handled coordination, employing every ounce of her strategic mind to ensure that supplies were distributed fairly. Tensions flared. Some cried out that they would not abandon ancestral homes. Others accused the crown of weakness, for bowing to the dead. Through it all, Jon and Daenerys reminded them of the alternative. Another war with the others might destroy everything. Better to compromise and survive. As the resettlement advanced, so did plans for a new barrier. Builders, engineers, and a few red priests from Essos joined in the effort, weaving spells and stacking stones. Dragonglass was embedded in the structure, runes carved into gateposts. It was not as grand or tall as the original wall, too massive a task for such short notice, but it had power. Melisandre had once spoken of fire and shadow forging wards to hold the darkness at bay. Those secrets, gleaned from the Red Temple's archives, now guided the hands of the spellcasters. Slowly, an uneasy shape of a new Westeros emerged. The realm below the barrier was battered, but alive with the living gathering to rebuild. Above, the land froze under the dominion of ice, a haunting domain that men dared not enter. And within that domain, the Night King ruled, a silent sentinel of winter. One late afternoon, as the final stones and wards were placed, Jon and Daenerys stood at the new barrier. The air smelled of pine and frost. Drogon perched on a nearby bluff, vigilant. Craftsmen and mages milled about, finishing the last touches. Jon could see the far north stretching away into mist, a cold land that looked less like part of Westeros and more like another world entirely. He turned to Daenerys. "We've done it. The wards are set." She nodded. "Let's hope they hold." She cast one last glance north, "and that we can live with this compromise." Jon followed her gaze. A hush settled between them as a breeze stirred the snow. In that stillness, he sensed the presence of something vast and ancient. The realm of ice had been claimed, and the realm of fire still smoldered. Between them stood this fragile boundary. Daenerys exhaled. "We'll keep watch, and if the dead stir again, we'll respond." Jon nodded. "Yes, we'll remain vigilant." In the east, the sky glowed with the first blush of sunset, painting the snow in faint pinks and golds. In the west, storm clouds gathered, hinting at another round of northern blizzards. It felt like a fitting image of the new Westeros, one half in light, the other in ice and shadow. Jon felt the tightness in his chest ease, if only a little. They had done what they must. Now, they had to find a way to live with it. He turned to Daenerys, and for a moment he thought of a future. Not one drenched in blood and terror, but one in which people learned to thrive despite the divide. A realm where dragons soared in the south and the dead kept to the north. Was it possible for them to find some semblance of peace? Daenerys caught his eyes and offered the faintest of smiles. "A new dawn will come, Jon." He nodded. "Yes," he murmured, though the question of whose dawn it would be hung unspoken in the air. They lingered a while longer, side by side, as the sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the realm draped in twilight. Above them, the first stars appeared, cold and distant lights shining upon a land that had broken every boundary between myth and reality. And somewhere, far beyond the edge of that barrier, the Night King gazed upon his silent kingdom of ice, an unfathomable presence that might one day stir again. Yet for now, there was peace. And in that fragile peace, hope found a foothold in the battered heart of Westeros. Each day dawned with an uneasy hush beyond Winterfell's newly established barrier, as if the earth itself remained uncertain of what the future might hold. Though the treaty had prevented open warfare between the living and the dead, many in Westeros struggled to grasp that such a pact could exist at all. The notion that the Night King, whose armies had once swept south in an unrelenting wave, now ruled the frigid expanse north of the barrier seemed equal parts miracle and horror. At Winterfell, the leadership of Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen was put to the test almost every hour. Neither was naive enough to believe that peace with the dead could be anything but precarious. As the weeks advanced, they busied themselves with preparations for the next round of winter storms, storms that still battered the north, even if the onslaught of whites had abated. The old God's Wood, with its ancient weirwood tree, stood in a deep hush beneath thick drifts of snow, as if contemplating the strangeness of this new age. Sansa Stark, Lady of the Vale, had once more returned to Winterfell, traveling under heavy guard along snow-choked roads. The chill seemed to slice through her furs as she dismounted in the courtyard. Beneath her calm exterior, her heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and determination. She had come to discuss the final steps of the resettlement process and to ensure that those loyal to House Stark would accept the shifting boundaries. The Stark name had always been synonymous with the North, but never before had the North itself been so drastically redefined. She arrived just as Daenerys and Jon were concluding a meeting with several northern lords. Sansa noticed the lines of fatigue etched into Jon's face, how Daenerys' shoulders sagged under the weight of leadership. Winter had always been cruel, but this winter was forging something unimaginable, a realm half in the hands of the living, half in the hands of an undead king. "Sansa," Jon said softly in greeting when he caught sight of her entering the hall. He looked grateful for the familiar presence of his sister, though a trace of worry lingered in his eyes. "Jon," she replied, stepping close and placing a gloved hand upon his arm. "I heard about the final wardings near the new barrier. Are they holding?" "So far," Daenerys answered. She stood a short distance away, offering Sansa a polite nod. "We've placed red priests on rotating patrols. Lawless magic, combined with the runes inscribed by the Archmasters, seems enough to keep the dead from crossing. Or so we hope." Sansa exhaled. "Let us pray it continues to hold. I've come with news from the Vale. We've housed over 300 free folk families who agreed to resettle. But more keep arriving, many unwilling to part with their old ways. I fear tension is brewing." Jon frowned. Tormund promised to speak to them, to explain that they have a choice: remain north of the barrier at their own peril, or come south and abide by the treaty's terms. "Has he run into trouble?" "He has," Sansa said, "but I'll let him explain. He returned from beyond the barrier 2 days ago with a handful of chieftains." She glanced toward the corridor. "They're waiting in one of the smaller chambers. Daenerys' brow knit. Bring them here. We should hear their concerns directly. If there are free folk still wandering too far north, we risk provoking the others or leaving innocent people vulnerable to whites." Jon concurred with a grave nod. Together, the three of them moved to a smaller council room adjacent to the Great Hall. Torches flickered against the stone walls, sending shadows skittering across the floor. Tormund Giantsbane awaited them by the hearth, accompanied by 3 wildling elders whose lined faces spoke of harsh winters survived. Snow melted from their boots, pooling on the floor in dirty puddles. The elder in the center, his braided gray beard reaching his chest, seemed to hold a position of authority among them. "We've come to speak about the border," he rumbled, his accent thick with the harsh cadences of the far north. "Our people have wandered those lands since before your kneelers built castles of stone. Now you say we must pass south or face the dead on our own." "We don't say it lightly," Jon said, stepping forward. He still wore the black cloak that recalled his time in the Night's Watch, though he now bore the Stark sigil on his doublet. "You've seen what the White Walkers can do. Even Tormund will tell you we can't protect you if you remain on the wrong side of that barrier." Tormund folded his arms across his broad chest. "He speaks true. I've been over that line twice in the last moon. The Whites and White Walkers keep their distance, like they're patrolling their new kingdom, making sure no warm-blooded folk wander there uninvited. One wrong step and they'll either claim you or kill you. Might even do worse. There's no reason to stay unless you've a death wish." The wildling elder's lips curved into a frown. "Aye, Tormund, we know your mind. But some of us are old. Our ancestors are buried in the frost. We'd rather die in our own land than live beneath southern rule." Sansa's voice took on a measured tone. "No one wishes to force you from your heritage. But it's not just southern rule we speak of. The Night King claims those lands now. You wouldn't be free, you'd be trapped under the threat of his whites." Daenerys' gaze swept over them. "If any remain who still doubt the power of the dead, they're either blind or mad. We're offering you a chance to live. The farmland south of Winterfell is sparse this time of year, but we'll find a way to feed you. If you choose to stay in the White Walker's domain, we can't help you." The elders exchanged glances. A younger wildling with fire-red hair spat on the floor. "We've never trusted your southern kings and queens. But at least Tormund says you two fought for all living folk when the dead first came. Maybe we'd be fools not to follow." The older man exhaled, turning his gaze on Tormund. "Let's take your advice. But there will be some, like the Ice River clans, who'd rather die in the cold than bow to a queen of dragons or a wolf king." Jon's expression tightened. "We're not demanding fealty, only that you come south to safety. If they refuse, it's their choice. But they need to understand that the dead will show no mercy." Tormund shook his shaggy head. "The Ice River clans never took well to reason. They live off seals and fish, rarely near other folk. I doubt they'll listen now." Daenerys rested her palms on the table, voice low. "If they refuse, that is on their own heads. But perhaps we can send a final warning. Let them know if they attempt to cross the barrier unannounced, or if the Night King chooses to raise them, we can't intervene." The wildling elders nodded, albeit reluctantly. Their world had been reshaped, and they understood survival hinged on a precarious arrangement. One by one, they left the chamber to gather their families. Tormund lingered with Daenerys, Jon, and Sansa, a cloud of concern shadowing his rugged face. "They're proud folk," he muttered once the door had closed. "We all are beyond the wall. But those who remain behind, they'll likely be lost. I've done what I can." "You've done enough," Jon said, clasping his forearm. "We can't save everyone, not if they won't accept the situation." Tormund gave a soft grunt. I only hope this bloody peace holds and we don't end up dead men ourselves." Sansa watched them both with a hooded gaze. "I should return to the Vale soon, but I'll stay until the next convoys of free folk leave Winterfell. I want to ensure supplies are properly allocated." Daenerys nodded. "Good. Meanwhile, Jon and I must meet with the Archmaster's envoy tomorrow about reinforcing the wards. The Red Priests claim to see shadows of doubt in their flames, whatever that means." Tormund snorted. "Shadows of doubt or shadows of truth? I never put much store in that fire god's talk. But if it keeps the dead on their side, I won't complain." With that, they parted ways. Jon and Daenerys headed toward the castle's eastern ramparts. Snow crunched underfoot as they walked, an ever-present reminder of winter's bite. Though the war against the dead was over in a grand sense, the north felt no less perilous. Jon paused at the top of the battlements, gazing out over Winterfell's courtyard. Long banners emblazoned with the Stark sigil fluttered in a cold wind. Soldiers patrolled with measured steps, while small folk bustled about in search of warmth or daily bread. Beyond the gates, caravans of free folk huddled in tents, waiting for safe passage south. The entire scene looked heartbreakingly transient, as though all of them hovered on the edge of a dream that might end at any moment. "Sometimes I wonder," Jon said softly, "if we've only delayed the inevitable. The Night King was so determined to march south. Will a mere border truly stop him forever?" Daenerys, standing beside him, let out a slow breath, watching it swirl in the icy air. "We can't know. For now, we hold this fragile truce. If he chooses to break it, we face him again. But perhaps he's seen enough destruction, enough loss, he may value his new realm more than the notion of further conquest." Jon gave a grim half-smile. "He's an enigma. But we'll remain on guard." He turned, catching the weary set to Daenerys' shoulders. "And you, how are you faring? You've borne so many burdens lately." She blinked, then mustered a faint smile. "I won't lie, the cost weighs on me. Ruling half a continent, fending off threats both living and dead, trying to preserve the Targaryen legacy, it's more than I ever dreamed or feared. But I have to keep going. If I falter, everything might unravel." Jon reached for her hand, gently clasping it. "You're not alone. Remember that." The gesture conveyed a warmth of shared responsibility, yet it also carried the lingering undertones of their complicated past. Ever since the revelation of Jon's parentage, Aegon Targaryen, as some still named him, the lines of authority between them had blurred. They had tried to navigate that tension, sometimes stumbling, sometimes finding unity in crisis. Now, with the realm partially at peace, the unresolved threads between them felt more tangible than ever. Daenerys squeezed his hand once, then pulled away as a guard approached with a slight bow, announcing the arrival of the Archmaster's envoy. Summoning fresh resolve, the queen nodded for Jon to follow. Together, they descended into the courtyard. Maester Idrian was a tall, spare man with close-cropped gray hair and a face that spoke of countless nights hunched over ancient tomes. He carried himself with precise dignity, layered in thick robes that bore the mark of the citadel, a silver link glinting at his collar. Near him stood a pair of younger maesters carrying carefully wrapped parchments, wax tablets, and small phials of ground minerals. "Your Graces," Idrian said, dipping his head as Daenerys and Jon approached. "Thank you for receiving us on such short notice. We have studied the wards placed upon this new barrier, and we bring our findings." Daenerys indicated they should move to a warmer space. "The library tower is quiet this hour," she said. "We'll speak there." Soon, they were gathered around a long wooden table in Winterfell's library. Flickering candles cast warm light upon the shelves of parchment. The cold stone walls captured echoes of their footsteps. Idrian spread out a map of the northern border. "We have records of the spells used by Brandon the Builder when the original wall was raised. Much of that lore was lost over centuries, but the citadel guarded certain fragments. The Red Priests have contributed their own incantations, which are less doku." "Meant?" Jon frowned. "What concerns you, Maester?" Idrian tapped a bony finger on a series of runic symbols drawn near the barrier's center. "These wards require regular feedings of magic. The Red Priests have volunteered to perform these rituals, but what if they fail or choose not to continue? This barrier, while formidable now, may weaken over time if not maintained." Daenerys exchanged a glance with Jon. "And if it weakens, the others could cross once more," she said quietly. The Maester nodded gravely. "Yes. The synergy of both your approvals was necessary. The so-called blood binding that occurred when you signed the treaty with the Night King has locked him into a magical contract of sorts. As part of that contract, his power sustains the wards from the northern side, while you sustain them from the southern side. It's a delicate balance. We suspect that if either side withdraws its intent to honor the boundary, the wards will deteriorate. That means if the Night King changes his mind, he can, in essence, unravel the barrier," Jon surmised. Idrian's lips pressed thin. "Precisely. We advise that you or your chosen representatives keep frequent watch on the ward's integrity. If they begin to falter, it's a sign the treaty is in jeopardy." Daenerys leaned back. "So it isn't a matter of simply erecting a wall and forgetting. It's an ongoing duty." "Indeed," Idrian said. "In the old days, the Night's Watch maintained the wall. They did so physically, patrolling, but also kept up certain arcane traditions. Now, those traditions will need to be revived or adapted. The Citadel is prepared to train men for this task." Jon ran a hand over his face. He recalled the vow he had once taken to guard the realms of men. "Then we'll do it. We'll raise a new watch, perhaps not in the same form, but with the same mission to ensure that barrier remains intact." Idrian looked relieved. "That is wise. We can help provide the knowledge, but you'll need manpower, men or women, for that matter, who can dedicate their lives to vigilance." Daenerys exhaled. "We'll have to gather volunteers. Many are weary of war, but perhaps some will see it as an honor to guard the border between life and death." They discussed further details for hours, poring over old parchments. The quiet of the library was broken only by the rustle of paper, the whisper of quills, and the low murmur of voices. Outside, the winter wind howled around the tower like a lone wolf. By the time Daenerys and Jon emerged, night had fully fallen. They parted ways with Maester Idrian, who would remain in Winterfell to continue his studies. Daenerys and Jon drifted to the courtyard where torches glowed in iron sconces. A handful of Unsullied stood guard. Across the yard, several figures gathered around a fire, warming hands and sharing stories of haunted nights beyond the barrier. Jon's gaze lingered on the battered towers, the parapets still being repaired. Though the Great War was over, the scars remained. He wondered if they would ever truly rebuild, or if Westeros would live in perpetual fear of the undead kingdom just over the horizon. Daenerys must have sensed his thoughts. She touched his arm gently. "We'll do what we must. We survived the impossible once. We can do it again if needed." He turned to her, heart heavy yet buoyed by her determination. "I know. I only hope this uneasy peace lasts long enough for us to truly recover." Deep in the shivering sea, cold winds raked across the deck of a lone ship. The vessel, a modest merchant cog from the Free Cities, had come seeking trade at White Harbor, only to find the city brimming with northern refugees. The captain, a wiry man named Barrys, had heard rumors of the treaty with the dead. He disbelieved them at first, but as he sailed closer to the northern waters, he couldn't shake an eerie chill that went beyond mere weather. Thick fog clung to the sea. Night pressed in, starless and impenetrable. Barrys kept a lantern raised at the bow, scanning for ice floes. His first mate, Jason, muttered curses under his breath. This voyage had been one misfortune after another, and they had nearly run aground on hidden ice more than once. Then the fog parted like a curtain, revealing a pale figure standing atop a jagged outcrop of ice that jutted from the sea. The figure did not move, did not so much as sway. Barrys felt his blood turn to slush. He had never seen a White Walker in his life, but the stories from travelers and exiled knights were seared into his memory. Pale skin, icy blue eyes, unstoppable and merciless. Jason gasped, stepping back. "Gods, Captain, is that?" Barrys grabbed the helm and swung the ship to starboard, trying to give the ice a wide berth. The pale figure watched them with unblinking eyes. In its grasp was a spear of crystalline ice. Barrys heard the rasp of fear in his own breath. Neither man spoke as they slowly passed the outcrop, the sails flapping in a stuttering wind. The White Walker did nothing, simply stood like a sentinel from some frozen nightmare. Only when the ship had drifted a fair distance away did the figure turn and fade into the gloom. Barrys and Jason exchanged stunned looks. They had traveled far and wide, but never had they witnessed such a being. It seemed to confirm the rumors. The dead had claimed these northern waters. A cold dominion indeed. Though the Walker had not attacked, the message was clear. Beyond that point, the sea belonged to the others. "What do we do now?" Jason managed to say, voice trembling. Barrys swallowed hard. "We turn around. We go back to White Harbor or further south. There's no coin to be made sailing these cursed seas. And gods help us if that creature changes its mind." Jason muttered a prayer to the seven. Barrys, not particularly devout, stared into the swirling fog. Some lines were not worth crossing. He gave the order, and the merchant cog slowly tacked south, sails creaking as they caught a biting wind. The oppressive silence behind them felt like a presence. What they did not see, in the darkness behind the ice spire, was another pale shape stepping onto the flow. The White Walker from the outcrop turned to meet its counterpart, an eerie synchronization in their movements. From a sheer cliff of ice rising out of the sea, a white eagle perched, eyes glimmering blue, silently observing the passing ship. The Watchers of the North were everywhere now, ensuring no intrusion went unnoticed. In Winterfell's Godswood, the ancient heart tree stood draped in snow. Red leaves formed a crimson canopy against the white, and the carved face wept icy tears down its trunk. Arya Stark knelt at its base, her breath whispering in the silence. She had returned the previous day, arriving without fanfare as she often did, slipping through gates and corridors like a ghost. Now, under moonlight, she contemplated the changes that had swept through her homeland. She thought of the battles she had fought, of the faceless men, of the training in bravos that had honed her into a weapon. She thought of the night she had plunged her dagger into the Night King's heart, only to watch him vanish into nothingness before her eyes, except that memory was from another timeline, another telling. In this reality, the Night King had been halted through a treaty of ice and fire. The lines of fate felt blurred, as though pieces had rearranged themselves in ways she never anticipated. Still, she had seen enough to know that destiny was neither fixed nor merciful. Her siblings had changed as well. Jon bore the mantle of leadership with a grim acceptance. Sansa balanced practicality and pride. Bran had ascended to some other plane of awareness, though she had heard little from him in recent moons. Even Rickon was gone, lost during the wars against House Bolton. Now Arya was home, and yet she felt a million miles away from the girl who once played with wooden swords in this very Godswood. A soft crunch of snow behind her drew her attention. She rose in one fluid motion, her slender blade at the ready, only to find Jon standing with a faint smile. He lifted his hands in a show of peace. "You move like a shadow," he said quietly. Arya let out a small breath of amusement. "Old habits. You found me anyway," he shrugged. Figured if you were back, this might be where you'd come. They stood under the watchful gaze of the weirwood face, the quiet hush of ancient branches overhead. Jon's expression was bittersweet. It's good to see you. Arya lowered her blade and embraced him, pressing her cheek against the rough texture of his cloak. And you, Jon, seems I can't stay away forever. He held her for a moment, then stepped back, searching her face. Where have you been this past year? Sansa said you were off on errands. Arya shrugged, the corners of her mouth turning wry. Let's say I had a list of tasks that needed doing. Some debts to settle, some knowledge to gain. I traveled west for a time, heard rumors about magic in the Sunset Sea. Most were just rumors, but I learned enough to know the world keeps spinning no matter what chaos stirs in Westeros. Jon nodded, though his eyes sparked with concern. You missed the forging of the treaty. The Night King and his White Walkers claimed the far north. We have a barrier set with wards, but it's tenuous. Arya's gaze hardened. I'd heard the whispers. So you and Daenerys truly made peace with him? We made a pact to save what remains, Jon answered. It was that or risk total annihilation. She studied him for a long moment in the moonlight. Was it the only way? From what I gathered, the last time an alliance was proposed with something that dark, it ended in betrayal. Jon exhaled, the memory of the negotiations weighing heavily on him. I can't say it'll last forever. But for now, Westeros can breathe. And that's worth a great deal. Arya slowly sheathed her blade. Well, I've seen enough of war to know how precious any reprieve can be. But I also know that illusions of peace can be shattered in an instant. Jon's shoulders tensed. And we must be ready if that time comes. A quiet enveloped them. Snow drifted from the branches above, dusting their cloaks. After a moment, Arya asked softly, Do you trust him, Jon? He met her gaze. I trust that he wants to keep what he's won. And that might be enough. Arya said nothing, but her eyes flickered with the keen scrutiny of someone who understood the shapes hidden in darkness. In her mind, the Night King was still an enemy, an embodiment of death. Yet she could see the burden Jon carried in forging this fragile peace. She would not add to it by voicing all her suspicions, at least, not yet. Finally, she touched his arm. Come, let's go inside. It's too cold for old friends to stand out here talking in riddles. Jon gave a small nod, and together they left the Godwood, the ancient tree bearing silent witness to yet another turn in the Stark family's story. In the days that followed, Arya observed Winterfell with a critical eye. She noted how refugees crowded the courtyard, how soldiers from various houses intermixed with Unsullied, how the tension of uncertain times hung over every conversation. She also noticed the subtle warmth that sometimes passed between Jon and Daenerys, once lovers, now co-rulers, united by necessity. It was a delicate dance of leadership complicated by the rightful claims each could hold to the Iron Throne and by Jon's reticence to wear any crown at all. Daenerys called a gathering to discuss the new Night's Watch that the Maesters had recommended. The great hall filled with lords, knights, and even a few ladies from across the realm. Sansa, Gendry, Brienne, Tormund, Arya, and many others took seats around a long table. Daenerys presided at the head, with Jon at her right. Torches cast dancing shadows across the worn banners overhead. We have an uneasy boundary, Daenerys began, projecting her voice through the hall. To maintain it, we must ensure the wards remain active. For that, we need watchers, men and women sworn to guard the barrier day and night, winter and summer. A low murmur rose among the assembled. Many remembered the Night's Watch of old, a brotherhood cloaked in black, their vow to guard the realms of men. Now that vow might need to be reborn, but in a realm so deeply scarred, who would volunteer? Jon cleared his throat. I once wore the black. I know the demands. We must ensure these watchers are well-provisioned and well-led. No cause for glory, no direct war to be fought, just vigilance. But it's crucial. Sansa spoke up, folding her hands on the table. And who commands them? The old watch chose its Lord Commander from within. We'll do the same, Daenerys said. But to begin, we might need an interim commander. One who understands the Watcher's duty intimately. Her gaze swept the hall. Many eyes turned to Jon, but he remained impassive, uncertain if that role still belonged to him. Then Daenerys' gaze shifted to someone else, Brienne of Tarth. Brienne blinked, her posture stiffening. Me, your grace. You are honorable, skilled in arms, and devoted to duty, Daenerys said. You've seen the threat of the dead. Yet you hold no direct claim to southern lands that might distract you. Would you consider leading the Watchers while they form, training them, establishing discipline? Brienne glanced at Sansa, who gave a supportive nod. It would be a great responsibility, Brienne replied slowly, but if this is the will of the realm, I will serve. Tormund piped up with a broad grin. The lady's fierce enough. She might keep those watchers from dozing off. A ripple of agreement passed through the hall, though there were also skeptical murmurs. The Night's Watch had been traditionally male, but so much tradition had burned away in the fires of war. Now practicality reigned, and Brienne was indeed a paragon of knightly virtue. Jon stood. If Brienne commands, I suggest we name the new order the Watchers on the Barrier, or simply the Barrier Watch. It's a fresh start for a new age. Daenerys nodded. Agreed. We'll dispatch ravens across the realm, seeking volunteers. Once we have enough, we'll begin training at one of the old castles near the new boundary. Eastwatch by the Sea was destroyed, but we might rebuild something akin to it. Gendry rose next, face determined. If you need weapons or supplies, I can rally blacksmiths in the Riverlands. We're short on steel, but if we mix with dragonglass, we can forge arms capable of defending the barrier if the others ever cross. Arya watched the discussion with a slight tilt to her head. She admired the optimism in the room, how these people, once scattered by war, were coming together to forge a new institution. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that they were building walls in a realm that had only just begun to take its first shaking breath of peace. The meeting continued for hours, hashing out logistics and future plans. By the end, Brienne had formally accepted the temporary command. A wave of relief passed through many in the hall, as if the realm had taken one more small step toward stability. Yet a silent anxiety remained. Would the Night King remain content in his icy kingdom, or had they merely laid the groundwork for a future confrontation? Arya's instincts led her to prowl the castle by night, slipping through corridors with the stealth she had perfected in the Free Cities. She wanted to see how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. In stables, she overheard worried grooms muttering about ghostly sightings beyond the barrier. In a tower used by the Red Priests, she caught hushed whispers about signs in the flames, unrest, shifting shadows, possibilities of betrayal. She found it curious that the Red Priests, who had once so fervently championed Daenerys, now sounded uncertain. One night, as she slipped along the walkway behind the Great Hall, she heard voices drifting from inside, a conversation between Tyrion Lannister and Davos Seaworth. She paused, listening through a narrow window. Another supply shipment gone astray, Tyrion muttered, frustration thick in his tone. Caravans meant for the southern settlements never arrived. We keep losing men to bandits, or perhaps they're just deserters who've had enough of this cold. Davos made a weary sound. Bandits, deserters, maybe the cell's words are turning to robbery. The war's ended, but not all men seek honest work. The chaos leaves openings for criminals. Tyrion sighed. And how do we keep the realm together when every day presents a new crisis? We have the Vale, the Stormlands, the Reach, some still devastated by the wars with the Lannisters, some mistrustful of Queen Daenerys, others uncertain of Jon's legitimacy. Meanwhile, the Iron Islands talk of independence again. And north of that dam barrier, an undead king holds an entire frozen domain. Davos's voice softened. We do what we can, Tyrion. Rebuilding trust is slow, especially after the madness in King's Landing, the battles at Winterfell, and everything else. But at least no one's actively waging a new war. Tyrion's half-laugh sounded hollow. Yet, no one's waging war yet. Gods, I sometimes wonder if the living are as dangerous to each other as the dead ever were. Arya slipped away, leaving them to their hushed conversation. Tyrion had hit on a truth she couldn't deny. Even without the White Walkers marching south, people could still tear each other apart. Peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered by greed, pride, and old wounds. As winter's grip deepened, Daenerys summoned her advisors to prepare for a journey south. Word had spread that King's Landing, still scarred from Cersei's downfall and the subsequent tussles for power, lay in precarious hands. A council of lords tried to govern in the absence of a clear monarch. Daenerys, though widely acknowledged as a rightful contender, had chosen to focus on the threat of the dead first. Now, with a tenuous truce in place, she realized she could not ignore the capital any longer. Jon was torn. He wanted to remain in the north, ensuring that the new barrier watch was formed properly, but Daenerys wanted him at her side for the southern campaign of rebuilding alliances. They debated late into the evening, huddled near the hearth in her private solar. If I leave now, Jon said, the north might feel abandoned again. We only just convinced them to accept an alliance with the Targaryen, and the barrier needs close oversight. Daenerys' eyes flared with the passion that always lurked beneath her composure. I understand, but the lords in the south see me as a distant queen with dragons and foreign armies. If we show unity, Stark and Targaryen together, they might be more inclined to offer allegiance. Otherwise, they'll think I've lost the North's support. Jon inhaled, shoulders tense. What if something goes wrong up here while we're away? She gave him a wry smile. We have capable people, Sansa, Arya, Davos, Tyrion. Brienne will lead the barrier watch. Tormund can advise if the free folk have needs. You can trust them. But if we don't address the power vacuum in King's Landing, the realm risks fracturing. The Iron Islands might break away, Dorne might remain independent, the Stormlands might rise with some new claimant. Then we'll have chaos at our doorstep. Jon stared into the flames dancing in the hearth, recalling how countless men and women died defending Winterfell against the dead. Now, the living required their presence, their guidance. All right, he said finally. We'll go together. But let's make this as swift as possible. I don't want to leave the North to fend for it. Self too long. A ghost of relief flitted across Daenerys's face. Thank you, Jon. I know it's difficult. He rose, pacing to the window that overlooked the courtyard. Snow glimmered in the moonlight, and he thought of the hundreds still camped within Winterfell's walls, waiting for a chance to head south. We'll bring a small retinue. Let's not make a grand show of force. I'm no fan of intimidation. She nodded, crossing to stand beside him. Agreed. We'll leave Grey Worm and most of the Unsullied to maintain order here, with strict orders to respect the local lords. Drogon can accompany us as a symbol of my power, but I won't use him to threaten. Not unless forced. Jon placed a hand on the stone windowsill. Let's pray we won't be forced. Word spread quickly of the royal pair's intention to travel south. Some saw it as an opportunity to present grievances, others worried that the newly established peace in the north might unravel in their absence. Sansa assumed a steely calm when Jon told her of his decision. I trust you to represent our family, Jon said to his sister as they conferred in the Great Hall. You've managed the Vale. You understand the North better than anyone. Sansa lifted her chin. I'll do my duty. You and Daenerys must do yours. Just promise you won't let the Southern Lords walk all over you with demands. The North has sacrificed more than enough. Jon smiled faintly. We won't forget. Arya, listening from the sidelines, approached them. When do you leave? In 3 days, Daenerys replied, stepping forward. We'll take a core group, Tyrion, a few guards, some advisors. The rest remain here. Arya studied Daenerys a moment, then her gaze slid to Jon. I want to come. Jon blinked. To King's Landing? Yes, Arya said. Her tone was calm but resolute. I've seen enough of the world to know danger lurks around every corner. If you and Daenerys are going into that nest of vipers, you'll need someone who can smell poison in the air. Daenerys arched an eyebrow. You think King's Landing is more dangerous than the Night King's domain? Arya gave a small, humorless laugh. Sometimes. At least the dead are straightforward in their malice. The living hide knives behind smiles. Jon recognized the conviction in Arya's voice. She was no longer a child who could be told to stay put. All right, we could use your skill. Daenerys didn't object. Very well. Your talents might prove invaluable. With that settled, they spent the remaining days coordinating final details. Tyrion drafted letters to the Southern Lords advising them of the impending arrival of the king in the north and the Dragon Queen. Gendry oversaw the forging of a small retinue's arms. Davos arranged the necessary provisions for a journey by sea. Winter storms made land travel arduous, so they would sail from White Harbor down to the Crownlands, hoping to avoid heavy ice floes. On the eve of their departure, Daenerys walked alone through the courtyard, pausing by the spot where she had first landed Drogon when she came to fight the dead. Darkness draped the battlements, torches flickered in the chill air. Memories rushed at her, visions of whites swarming, men screaming, flames roaring as Drogon unleashed fire. So many had died. Now, their sacrifice had bought a reprieve. Yet the realm still fractured with old grudges, new ambitions, and the quiet threat of an undead kingdom looming just beyond a magical barrier. She looked up to see Sansa approaching, wrapped in a fur-trimmed cloak that spilled over her shoulders. The flicker of torchlight revealed the subtle tension in the Lady of Winterfell's features. Your Grace, Sansa said with polite formality, dipping her head. Then, after a moment, she lowered her voice. You're about to enter a different battleground. The southern courts can be as deadly as any battlefield. Daenerys smiled wryly. I've heard such warnings before. One might argue I've already faced the dead. Will the living truly be worse? Sometimes they can be, Sansa replied. You're strong. But strength alone won't be enough if the lords sense weakness or if they resent you for your Targaryen blood. Daenerys's expression turned thoughtful. I understand. I have Tyrion to guide me in matters of politics, and Jon, well, he stands beside me. But I won't pretend it will be easy. Sansa's gaze flickered. You and Jon do make a compelling pair. Some see you as an unbreakable alliance, others see you as a threat. Just know that I'll be here, guarding the north, ensuring that no one stabs us in the back while you're gone. Daenerys considered the red-haired Stark carefully. They had come a long way since their initial distrust. I appreciate that. Truly. I know this realm means everything to your family. Sansa's lips curved into a thin smile. And you mean everything to Jon, whether he admits it or not. Be safe, Daenerys. Before Daenerys could respond, Sansa turned and left, her cloak trailing behind her. The Dragon Queen stood there a moment longer, lost in thought. She had never intended to fall for Jon in the way she had, nor had she expected the complexities of ruling a shattered realm. Yet here she was on the cusp of another journey, uncertain if destiny would favor them or crush them beneath its relentless wheel. Early the next morning, a small procession set out from Winterfell. Snow swirled under a leaden sky as Daenerys, Jon, Arya, Tyrion, and a handful of trusted guards rode forth on horseback. Sansa and Brienne stood by the gates to bid them farewell, alongside Davos, Gendry, and Tormund. Drogon soared overhead, circling once before swooping to follow them. Winter's bitterness nipped at their cheeks as they traveled the short distance to White Harbor. Though the roads had improved since the initial floods of refugees, they still encountered caravans and stragglers heading south for warmer climes. Some recognized Daenerys' silver-gold hair, some recognized Jon as the king in the north. They bowed or stared, uncertain whether to be in awe or in fear. Arya rode near the front, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. She wore no sigil, only practical leathers and a cloak that blended with the winter landscape. At times, she drifted ahead to scout, returning with quiet updates on the road's condition. Jon often found himself glancing at her, struck by how much she had grown from the spirited tomboy he once knew. Now she was lethal grace, tempered by knowledge of the wider world. He realized she had secrets in her eyes, experiences he might never fully understand. Tyrion rode beside Daenerys, shoulders hunched against the cold. He pulled his fur cloak tighter and sighed. I miss the warmer breezes of the south, your grace. But I suppose the north has its charms, particularly if you like frostbite. Daenerys huffed a small laugh. We'll be in White Harbor soon enough where we can find a ship. The sea might be cold, but at least we'll have a berth and a chance for hot meals. Jon glanced back. Just be cautious. There could be ice floes lurking in the bay. We'll take care, Tyrion assured him. I'll see to the ship's readiness personally. The miles passed in thoughtful silence. Snow-laden forests gave way to open fields, then to the outskirts of White Harbor where the faint smell of brine drifted on the wind. The city's walls rose on the horizon, though the harbor outside them was clogged with vessels, merchant ships, fishing boats, and a few war galleys. A sign of increased activity as people fled or came seeking trade. By dusk, they entered White Harbor through the main gate. The garrison, now loyal to House Stark after many upheavals, recognized Jon's standard and saluted. They rode past low stone buildings, shops closing for the evening, and townsfolk gathering around fires. Whispers followed them, news traveled swiftly in a place so full of comings and goings. They found lodging at a modest manor near the docks, courtesy of the harbor master who bowed profusely at the sight of Daenerys and Jon. Drogon perched on a barren hillside outside the city, his presence enough to deter any would-be troublemakers. That night, the travelers convened around a long table in the manor's hall, reviewing the next leg of their journey over a meal of fish stew and ale. Jon studied the battered map Tyrion had procured. We'll sail south along the coast. Hopefully, we can avoid storms. If all goes well, we'll reach King's Landing in less than 2 weeks. Arya leaned over the map. We should keep an eye on Storm's End. If the lords there are restless, they might intercept us. Daenerys nodded. We'll remain vigilant, but I'd rather not approach them in a hostile manner. We come as allies, seeking to unify the realm. Tyrion tapped the parchment. There's also the matter of Dragonstone. You might wish to stop there briefly, your grace. It's your ancestral seat. Daenerys' expression softened. Dragonstone? Yes, it's been too long since I last saw it. We could resupply there if needed. The island fortress might also make a strategic meeting point for any lords who wish to pledge support before we reach the capital. Jon considered this. Let's do it. Dragonstone first, then to King's Landing. They talked late into the night, finalizing details and possible contingencies. Arya eventually excused herself, slinking away into the corridors of the manor, silently exploring its nooks and crannies. She overheard gossip about a smuggler's ring, rumored sightings of whites on a distant shore, and fearful rumors that the Night King might yet break the treaty. Nothing conclusive, but enough to remind her that fear was a powerful currency in these uncertain days. When dawn arrived, they boarded a sturdy carrack named the Sea Raven, which had been outfitted to withstand ice-choked waters. Tyrion inspected its hull with a critical eye, deemed it acceptable, and soon they were setting sail. Daenerys stood on the forecastle, cloak snapping in the wind, while Jon took position near the helm to keep an eye on navigation. Arya wandered the deck, scanning the gray sea. The tide bore them away from White Harbor, past the breakwaters and into open water. Drogon flew overhead, occasionally skimming low enough that the ship's crew would clutch their hats and reel from the gust of wind. The great dragon cast a dark shadow on the waves, a living testament to the might that Daenerys still wielded. Yet for all that power, she felt the weight of the realm pressing down on her soul. Uncertainty shadowed every horizon, even the wide expanse of sea. They sailed for days, passing rugged coastlines and jagged cliffs. They saw no sign of White Walkers this far south, though the memory of the White Messenger remained vivid in their minds. Storm clouds rumbled on occasion, and they had to tack to avoid rough seas. Arya often perched near the bow, eyes on the horizon, as if searching for shapes in the mist. Now and then, a passing merchant vessel would wave flags in greeting or drift at a wary distance upon spotting the dragon overhead. The Sea Raven made decent time, though the cold slowed them whenever ice formed on the deck. Tyrion, bundled in furs, spent much of the journey below, sipping warmed wine and penning letters to potential allies, while Jon and Daenerys took turns on watch. One evening, as the sky blossomed in pale orange at sunset, Daenerys joined Jon by the railing. She'd just come from feeding Drogon, offering him salted fish from a net they lowered. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, hair whipped by the wind. "How fares the King of the North at sea?" she asked with a teasing note, recalling how Jon once confessed his discomfort with sailing. He gave a small smile. "I've never been fond of boats, but I'm managing. It's calmer than the time I sailed beyond the wall." She nodded, leaning on the rail. "You realize that once we reach Dragonstone, we'll be stepping onto Targaryen ground, a place shaped by my ancestors." He eyed her. "Is that daunting or comforting?" Daenerys gazed over the darkening waves. "Both. My ancestors built Dragonstone, forged the Valyrian steel swords, and from there they conquered Westeros. Now I return, not as a conqueror, but as someone trying to hold this fragile realm together." Jon let the silence linger for a moment, then murmured, "Perhaps it's fitting. The place that once symbolized conquest now becomes a refuge for cooperation. A place where we can gather allies instead of subjugating them." She appreciated his perspective, though part of her soul still carried the weight of her ancestors' fire and blood. The Targaryen tradition was one of domination, but she had long since vowed to break that wheel. Even so, she couldn't fully quell the sense of a destiny that beckoned her to the Iron Throne. As night settled in, the stars shimmered faintly through wispy clouds. The hiss of the sea against the hull provided a steady lullaby. Below decks, Tyrion dozed in a hammock, while Arya paced the cramped corridors, restless. One of the crew members muttered about strange shapes in the water, but upon closer inspection, it was only drifting seaweed. On the 10th day out of White Harbor, they finally sighted the volcanic rock spires of Dragonstone on the horizon. Thick clouds spiraled above the island's craggy peaks. The outline of the castle rose against the sky, a dark silhouette that evoked ancient power. Daenerys felt a curious mix of nostalgia and tension coil within her. This had once been her home, briefly, when she landed in Westeros with her armies. Now she returned in a different era with different goals. They navigated carefully toward the harbor. The Sea Raven dropped anchor near the old Targaryen docking point, and a smaller skiff ferried them ashore. Drogon soared overhead, letting out a roar that echoed among the basalt cliffs. Jon, Daenerys, Arya, and Tyrion disembarked, accompanied by a handful of guards. The stony beach crunched underfoot, waves lapping at the narrow shore. A steep stairway carved into the rock led upward toward the castle gates. Daenerys paused at the base, remembering the first time she climbed these steps, how the wind whipped her hair and the weight of her ancestors pressed upon her. She glanced at Jon, who gave an encouraging nod. Together they ascended. Each footfall echoed on ancient stone. Spires of rock jutted on either side, giving the impression of a dragon's maw swallowing them whole. Arya scanned the path warily, one hand near the hilt of her dagger. Tyrion puffed behind them, already weary from the climb. At the top, they found the massive gates partly ajar. The fortress had been minimally staffed since Daenerys moved her forces to fight the dead. A few loyal caretakers remained, though no large garrison. They emerged onto the courtyard which overlooked the sea. Smoke curled from distant vents in the volcanic mountains. The walls bore the sigil of House Targaryen, a three-headed dragon, partially weatherworn but still visible. "It's been too long," Daenerys murmured, stepping forward. Memories of unsullied footsteps echoing in formation of Tyrion's first odd expression of Missandei's gentle counsel all flooded back. The sorrow of her losses, Yora, Missandei, two of her dragons, tightened her chest. Jon moved beside her, respectfully silent. Arya wandered off to inspect the ramparts while Tyrion waited for the guards to approach the caretaker. An older knight wearing Targaryen colors rushed to greet them with a bow. "Your Grace," he said, voice trembling with reverence. "You've returned. We've kept the castle as best we could. Supplies are limited, but we can accommodate you and your party." Daenerys touched his arm. "Thank you for your diligence. We won't stay long, only enough to resupply and possibly hold a few meetings with allies." Her gaze swept the courtyard. "It's good to see it kept intact." He escorted them inside the main keep, a sprawling structure carved from the island's basalt. The halls were dim, lit by torches set in dragon-headed sconces. Though not grand by Red Keep standards, Dragonstone possessed an austere beauty, full of tight corridors and swirling stone motifs reminiscent of Valyrian architecture. After a brief inspection of the staterooms, Daenerys and Jon reconvened in the Great Hall. It was simpler than the one at King's Landing but carried an echo of majesty, with pillars shaped like dragon talons and a carved basalt throne at the far end. Daenerys approached that throne, running her fingers along the cold stone. She remembered the day she first claimed it upon her arrival, a day bursting with hope that she might liberate Westeros from tyranny. Fate had taken a twisting path since then. Tyrion cleared his throat softly. "We should send ravens to the major houses, announcing your presence here. They might be more inclined to travel here than risk the unrest in King's Landing." Jon nodded. "Let's do it. The more allies we can gather peacefully, the better. We'll see who's willing to negotiate for a stable realm." Arya stepped up, her footsteps almost silent on the stone floor. "I can help ensure those allies are who they claim to be," she said in a quiet tone. "Masks can hide many faces." Daenerys looked to her, a question in her eyes. Arya only offered a slight grin. "I have a particular set of skills for spotting liars." Tyrion arched an eyebrow, aware of some of Arya's rumored exploits but not the full extent. "Any advantage is welcome." Daenerys summoned a caretaker to prepare rooms for the night. Tomorrow, they would dispatch ravens. The plan was to invite representatives from the Stormlands, the Reach, the Westerlands, any region uncertain about the new leadership. With luck, a few might come in good faith to see if Daenerys Targaryen, the breaker of chains, still burned with the same fire or if she had tempered her ambition with the responsibilities of peace. Before retiring, Daenerys found herself alone in the throne room, gazing at the stone seat that had once been the seat of Targaryen power on this island. She could almost sense the ghosts of her ancestors whispering through the walls. Part of her longed for a simpler life, away from the burdens of crowns and treaties with undead kings. Yet she knew she had taken a path from which there was no simple turning back. The realm needed stability, someone to guide it, unify it. And if not her, who? She placed a hand on the edge of the throne, feeling the chill. "Let the wheel break for good," she whispered, recalling her old vow. "No more fear, no more tyranny. Let us find a way to live." Her voice echoed softly, swallowed by the vaulted chamber. Outside, the wind sighed against the fortress walls, carrying the salt tang of the sea. Far to the north, a land of ice and silent whites waited under the dominion of the Night King. Far to the south, the Seven Kingdoms waited for leadership, some with eager hands, some with concealed daggers. And here, on Dragonstone, Daenerys Targaryen stood poised between them, a figure of destiny wrestling with the ghosts of the past and the fragile hopes of the future. Yet for that moment, there was only the hush of stone halls, the flicker of distant torches, and the slow rise and fall of her breath. The weight of a realm pressed on her shoulders. Tomorrow, she would send ravens and begin the careful dance of alliances. But tonight, in the silence of Dragonstone, she allowed herself one heartbeat of peace, a single quiet moment in the eye of the storm that was Westeros, divided between ice and fire.